Hey everyone, and welcome to this month's live event with Heather Thomas. She's once again here to answer all of your quilting questions, so thank you so much for being here, Heather.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. All right, so our first question, this came in, this is from Josetta, and she says that she's become very electrically sensitive and must limit her exposure to the sewing machine. She needs to start hand quilting a baby quilt she's completed for her granddaughter that has animal shapes made in multiple colors, and she's wondering what color of thread she should use. Should I use the same color as each of the fabrics as you recommend for machine quilting and forget about what the back will look like? Or should I use a neutral color that will blend with both the back and the front of the quilt?
You know, this is just a personal preference, sort of. The very first quilt I ever made, I hand quilted, and it had about 8 different colors in it. And I went out and found those 8 colors of hand quilting thread, and I used them, but I used them in 2 ways. I used them on their color, but then I also used them contrasting on other colors. And to this day, I just love that quilt because it looks so cool. This is just about how well you hand quilt. If you have a really beautiful hand quilting stitch, then why not make that stitch really show up on both sides? If you're not much of a hand quilter and this is new to you, then you may want to make sure that that thread blends as much as possible from the front. Now, when it comes to choosing that backing fabric, you can always choose a multicolored backing fabric that has all the colors that are in the front of the quilt. And that way, the colors are going to look good on both sides. So there is no right or wrong. There's simply your personal preference and your skill set. How well your skill set is going to either show off your wonderful stitches or sort of hide those not so wonderful stitches. So think about some contrast if your stitches are great, and think about as much blending as possible if you're new to hand stitching.
Perfect. Now, I just thought of this just because she said she's limiting time to her sewing machine, but not using it altogether. Is there ever a time where you would combine hand quilting and machine quilting?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. One of the things that you could do is that you could, do some inline stitching, 1/4 inch inside each of the blocks, and then use hand stitching to go around each of the shapes or something. That is going to make the quilt a little sturdier. A hand quilted baby quilt, it's not going to last all that long. And a lot of people don't really care. They just want it to last the baby's little babyhood. I like my baby quilts to last until that kid is 18, and I tend to make them not babyish for that reason. So it really just depends on how you think that quilt is going to be used. Oftentimes, though, when you give somebody a hand quilted quilt, instead of using that quilt, they fold it up and put it on a shelf and keep it for good. Or they preserve it for posterity, or they'll hang it on the wall. So if those are the things that are probably going to happen, then you can get away with very little quilting on it, and it will be all right.
Perfect. All right, this next question, this is from Ruby, and she wants to know, what was the name of the soap you use in laundering all of your quilts? Pulls dyes out and keeps them from bleeding.
That would be Synthropol.
Okay.
Syntropol. Synthropol. And again, you can order it anywhere. You can go to Amazon and get Synthropol. You can just put in the word Synthropol, and 1,000,001 pages are going to come up of where you can order it from. You don't need to follow the instructions exactly because the instructions say hot water. All you need to use is really warm water. So if you put everything on a warm setting, you're good to go. And it's just one of the safest ways to launder your fabrics and your finished quilts.
Perfect. Now, just in case somebody has heard you mention the other product you've used in the past, Retain, can you explain the difference between Synthropol, Retain, when you'd use one or the other?
Okay. Synthropol is for taking out excess dye. That's what it does. It takes out any excess dye. Retain does the exact opposite. Think of that. It's spelled with a Y, but it simply means retain. It is to push in the dyes and hold them so that they don't fade. It's for old quilts, old fabrics. So new stuff, use Synthropol. Old stuff, use Retain.
Perfect. All right, next question here. This is from Virginia, and she said, my sister-in-law passed away unexpectedly last December. In June, my brother asked if I would make a quilt using her PJs. Of course, I said yes. The PJs are made of fleece and jersey knit. I'm sure I should stabilize the fabric, but I would like to get Heather's advice before I actually begin to cut them up. I love this show and value Heather's expertise.
Well, thank you, Virginia. And I'm really sorry about your sister, but I think it's wonderful that you're going to honor her for her husband's sake. And I think it's kind of very poignant that he wants to be wrapped in her old 90s. I think that's just one of the sweetest things I've heard in a very long time. So, yes, you want to basically treat those like you would a t-shirt quilt. And so you want a very lightweight, iron-on, non-woven interfacing. So lightweight, iron-on, non-woven interfacing. And that's what you're going to back all of your fabrics with, even if they don't stretch. So the flannels probably aren't going to stretch like the knits are going to stretch. However, it's best if everything has the same hand or weight to it. So back everything with that so that it all feels the same as you needle through it. It all acts the same as you cut and press it and sew it. So that's a very lightweight, non-woven, iron-on interfacing. And then you're good to go.
Now, if you accidentally got a woven interfacing, what would...
Well, the thing with woven, there really aren't a whole lot of woven interfacings, and the ones that are there, the problem is that you're trying to fix a woven problem. Woven things tend to move and shift. They have a bias stretch, whereas a non-woven doesn't, and that's what's doing the bulk of the work. It's not actually the fact that there's a fabric back there. It's the fact that there's a fabric back there that has no bias stretch and has no stretch along the grain at all. And so it's that non-woven that's important.
Gotcha. All right, this next question here is from Dottie, and she says that she had a Lone Star quilt kit that had interfacing to sew the pieces on, which made a beautiful quilt. She would like to know if you know where she could get another pattern like that. So maybe a pattern for a Lone Star quilt. If there's
I don't personally know, but I do believe that Google or Chrome might know. So if you Googled something sort of like Lone Star interfacing or Lone Star iron-on piecing, or Lone Star kit, chances are you're going to come across it on the internet. I myself just personally don't know. I have to tell you, I'm a little bit out of the loop right now. So I don't know the answer for you, except that I know it can be found on the computer. And if you yourself aren't computer savvy, hopefully you have a child or a grandchild who is.
Absolutely. Or, just one of those things where you can just ask, okay, Google, and then it'll just do it for you.
Right.
All right, our next one here, this is from Marcia, and she wants to know, is there a stitch regulator that you can buy to retrofit old sewing machines with? I'm doing free motion quilting on my vintage 1973 Viking, and it's a little sketchy. If not, do you have any good tips for keeping stitch length consistent?
Well, I don't know of any stitch regulators that will retrofit to old machines. I don't think they've come out with those yet, and I seriously doubt that they will, because what the industry wants is for you to buy a new machine, and so they're not going to give you modern tools for old machines. It very rarely happens. So I wouldn't hold my breath on that one. I love stitching on an old Viking, something that's from the 70s and 80s. I think it's heaven. So one of the things that I can suggest to you is that well, first of all, let me explain. If you're having big stitches in some areas and small stitches in other areas and perfect stitches in other areas, it's simply because you haven't got to the point where you're matching your hand speed to the speed of the machine. And frankly, it takes practice. And I don't mean, 4 hours of practice. I mean about 50 hours of practice. And so I always tell people that generally you need 4 or 5 ugly quilts, and then you're probably good to go. That being said, the first thing I'd like you to do is to try your free motion quilting with your feed dogs in the up position. Don't lower your feed dogs if this is an option. So if this is an option, what's going to happen is this is going to give you a greater sense of control when you move that quilt underneath the foot. Another option is if you have presser foot pressure, the opportunity to change presser foot pressure. A lot of times the pressure foot pressure isn't really tight enough. So it's the opposite of raising your feed dogs back up. And if you can lower that presser foot a little bit lower to the bed of the machine, that will give you a greater sense of control. But really what it comes down to is that these older machines have no speed control and the new machines do. The new machines, you can set your speed control, floor the machine, and know that you're going the same speed all the time, and then it becomes much easier to match your hand speed to that machine. But that's not what all of us have, and I did not have that for the first 20 years of my free motion quilting career. So what I learned and what I taught my students who also did not have that speed control was to listen to the machine. Your machine, when you start to go really, really fast, is going to start to make a new whirring machine sound. Whirring, W-H-I-R-R-I-N-G, whirring sound. And that means that you're in high speed. I believe your best control is going to be found at about 70-75% of the maximum speed. And this happens just before you get to that whirring sound. So I taught my students always to take it to that whirring sound and then lift your foot off just a bit until that whirring sound stops of your machine. And that's the speed you want to maintain. So one of the best ways I know to learn to maintain a speed is if you have an office chair. Office chairs, first of all, are the most comfortable for machine quilting, and they usually have 5 legs that come off of them. You can put the heel of your driving foot on one of those legs and put the presser foot right underneath your toes. And so you're resting your heel on the leg of your chair, and you can control your pressure much more easily that way. You can actually put it in a position and keep it in that position and never think about it again. So that is my suggestion to you. If you're not sewing in an office chair, find one on Craigslist, go buy yourself a nice new comfy one, whatever. Switch to an office chair. Switch the position where your heel is on one of the 5 legs of that chair. The presser foot is underneath your toes, and you can rest your toes on the presser foot instead of having to push down on the presser foot. Find that 70-75% of maximum by listening to the whirring of your machine. And once you get there, strive to always stay there. Then, once you get comfortable, always at that speed, match the movement of your hands to that speed. And what you're going to do is just practice playing with the perfect length of stitch. And so you're just going to go under there with that machine going that speed. And first you're just going to kind of swirl back and forth. And then you're going to make some tighter circles. And then you're going to make some straighter lines. And you're just going to practice. And you're going to get used to the feel of how fast your hands have to move when you're going that speed. And what you're doing is you're training your body to muscle memory. And after you've done this for a while, the next time you sit down to do it, you're going to have a consistent stitch length. And it's going to continue to be consistent because your body remembers the speed at which it needs to move. But it takes practice. You have to make some ugly quilts before you can get to the point where you're making beautiful quilts. I have to tell you, my first probably 10 quilts are substandard. And they're substandard because of all those problems everybody else has with machine quilting. It wasn't until I understood how I have to match my hand speed to the speed of the machine, and I understood how it's all about muscle memory, that I could finally relax in front of the machine. And once I relaxed, the quilt started getting really good. So, have a glass of wine too. It might help.
That always helps. Relax you a little bit. I have to say, I've sewn for years, and I'm sitting in my office chair now. I have never sewn in my office chair, and I had to look down to see that there was 5 little things, and I tried that out with putting your foot on there, and that's an awesome little tip. I've always just had like a little folding chair or 4-legged chair.
That's just crazy. We spend so many hours in our sewing room and in front of our machine, and we should have a very comfortable chair. The chair I'm sitting in is this fabulous leather office chair that I found on Craigslist for nothing, and it's just amazing to sit in.
Perfect. Well, I'm gonna have to try that out next time. And I want to point out too that I know we have several videos where you have demonstrated practicing free motion quilting. I know you even have classes where you show how to do free motion quilting. So if you have any need to see Heather actually doing the body movement as well as the hand movement to get those even stitches. We have more than enough video resources.
Let me tell you, when you watch those videos, don't look at what I'm stitching. That doesn't matter to you. Look at how I'm stitching it. Look at how I'm approaching the machine. Look at where my hands are, where my shoulders are, where my body is. Those are the things that are going to really impart good information to you.
Absolutely. And I think one of those things is how you hold the quilt, because when I first started, I thought your hands had to lay flat like this and you move it around, but you actually grab a hold of your quilt and move it.
Yeah. And do you grab hold of yours now, Ashley?
I do now, yes.
Good.
It's much
Good.
easier to move it. Otherwise, it's always slipping, or I know they make those fancy grippy gloves.
You don't need any of those things.
Always work. Yeah.
No, just hold that like you're holding the steering wheel of a bus.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. Okay. I mean, you know, I still prefer stitch in the ditch over motion, but you know.
I know.
All right, our next question here. This is from Linda, and she wants to know, what batting do you like to use most of the time?
That's such an open-ended question, Linda. It depends on what I'm making. So if I'm making a bed quilt, for me, then I want a very lightweight cotton batting, because when I lay down in bed, I get hot, and I don't want a hot quilt. Other people lay down in bed and get cold, and so they do want a very warm quilt. So if you want a cool quilt, cotton is the way to go. If you want a warm quilt, then wool or silk, or a blend of cotton, wool, silk, any of those things, rayon, bamboo, mixed with those animal products, the wool or the silk, is a great way to go, because they trap heat. I never, ever, ever advocate using polyester for lots of reasons, but mostly because it's a fire hazard. So, plus you sweat like a pig underneath it, which doesn't sound like fun to me, because it traps heat and won't wick away moisture, so you sweat. So if we're going to talk brand names, then Orient, because I said it wrong one time and I want to make sure it's right this time. Orient by Quilter's Dream is just absolutely splendorific. It is a mixture of cotton and bamboo and tencel with a little bit of silk for warmth. It's quite thin. It needles beautifully. It drapes beautifully, even when you quilt the bejeebers out of it. I love it. But I wouldn't use it for a wall quilt because it's too drapey. For a wall quilt, for a table runner, I am going to use Warm and Natural. Because it's stiff and dense, and I would never use it for a bed quilt because it's stiff and dense, and I want my bed quilts to be soft and drapey so I can pull them around me. So those are my two kind of go-tos. There's other stuff I use, because sometimes if I got a black background, I'm going to use a black batting, and the black battings that I found, I know there's a 100% cotton one out there. I just haven't been able to find it readily available. And the one that I do use is 80% cotton and 20% poly. After I've said I hate poly, but I've done a burn test on it. So it takes 6 inches of burn, which is a long time for something to burn. It takes about, I think it takes about 7 or 8 minutes for a quilt to burn 6 inches before you get a little drop of plasticky resin. So it's not as nearly as bad as 100% polyester that is instantly hot drops of plasticky resin, which embed in the skin of people, and it's horrifying. So those are kind of my go-tos.
Perfect. And Anne, I see that your question was just pretty much the same thing about batting, so I hope that answers all of your questions as well. You did mention black batting. Don't you also hand dye some of your battings?
Yes, well, I hand paint, yes.
Okay.
So hand painting batting is a spectacular thing if you've never done it before. And I use it mostly on wall pieces. And I use it on wall pieces when I'm just too darn lazy to put a binding on, or I think a binding would put too much of a stop on the activity that's happening in the art piece. And so what I do is I take my batting, and it has to be a natural batting, and preferably not wool, because wool batting has all this fluff to it and this air inside, and the paint gets stuck in there and it never dries and it's paint. So really cotton or bamboo is your best bet. And I take any type of fabric paint and I thin it down. So my favorite is to use an already thinned down, highly pigmented fabric paint that's made by Jacquard, and it's called Dynaflow. The word dye, N-A-F-L-O-W. It's a paint that flows like a dye. and it's highly pigmented, but it's very thin. So even it I thin down half and half. And I put it into a container, and then I push my batting. But first I've cut my batting the size I want it to be, because this process kind of seals the edges. So then I stick my batting down into that paint, and I push it in there, and I work that paint in there, because sometimes it's hard to get in there. You just work it in, work it in, work it in, and then you wring it out really well, and either lay it flat to dry if you don't want any mottling on it, or lay it crumpled up to dry, and it will mottle. Whatever color it is, the dark, it'll wick the paint up to the high areas, and it'll be darker there, and then the lower areas will be lighter. And it's nice to have that mottling, and it does show depending on how much you leave the batting showing. So when I do that batting, I cut my backing a tiny smidge bigger than my batting, lay the batting on top, and make sure both of those are at least 1 inch bigger than my top, so that I have at least a 1/2 inch showing around. And then I top stitch around the outside edge of that quilt when I'm done quilting it. And that just holds everything together. And basically the batting and that little bit of backing fabric acts as a final frame. And because the paint has kind of curled up the edges of that batting, it doesn't need a binding. It kind of seals that batting. It's a really cool effect. I really, really like it. So yeah, you can paint your batting too.
So then what happens if you have already done your batting and then you make your quilt smaller than you intended? Can you still then trim it, and will it be?
You can't trim it, but it's not going to have that wonderful rumply edge that it gets. So I would say don't dye paint your batting until after your quilt top's done.
Perfect. Okay. Our next question here, this is from Autumn, and she says that she's been practicing quilting patterns and was wanting to know what your favorite quilting pattern is for blank spots.
For what?
Blank spots. So wide open.
For background, I guess is what you mean. Well, I guess it depends on the size of the quilt. This is a really interesting statement I'm going to make, but I started doing things a certain way when it came to quilting motifs on quilts about 10 years ago. And I did it in response to the blooming over quilting that was taking place on quilts, where people were doing things just so decoratively, and the quilting was overwhelming the piecing. And now, as I move away from quilting and others kind of come in and take my place, I see that people have really finally learned. If you make your quilting so decorative that it fights with the piecing, then the eye has no place to rest when it looks at the work. So if you're talking about negative space, then what I say is simplicity reigns. There are times when a stipple is the answer. There are times when a crosshatch or a wavy crosshatch is the answer. There are times when you can get by with something a little bit more ornate, like a double wavy crosshatch or a loop-de-loop, those sorts of things. But negative space, the blank spaces, the big open spaces, are usually places that we want to go away. We want them to sit back in the background and allow the positive space to come forward. That being said, you know, if we're a really good quilter and we like to have a lot of fun with a lot of fun motifs, then we should think of that when we're choosing our designs, when we're choosing the way that we piece. And we should piece in such a way that we have areas that we can put those decorative stitches in that aren't going to overwhelm that piecing. So keep in mind that the simpler the piecing is, the more ornate the quilting can be. The more ornate the piecing is, the simpler the quilting should be. What you don't want is combating elements there on the surface. You want one to augment or show off the other. You don't want them fighting with each other. I mean, I love to quilt feathers. I think feathers are so fun to quilt, but I almost never quilt feathers anywhere except in a plain border or in a whole cloth quilt, because feathers overwhelm so much piecing. I recently saw the most stunning star quilt, and the star quilt was just so beautifully pieced and so beautifully colored, but the person had put a feather everywhere she could put a feather. And all you could see was the feathers. You could barely even see the stars. I had to stand back about 20 feet and squint before I saw the stars. And I went, oh my God, there's stars in there. And they're cool stars. I don't think I've ever seen that star before, because she came up with some really obscure star design. And it was a shame, because I could tell that she spent a lot of time and energy on her color choices and on designing the star block. And it was lost to the quilting. Lost to the quilting. So simple piecing, elegant, very bold, very beautiful quilting. Very bold, beautiful piecing, very simple quilting. Now I'm going to go roundabout and say, you know, feathers I love to quilt, circles I love to quilt. But my absolute favorite thing to quilt are flowers. And I'm just not a flowery girl. I wear black and jeans all the time. I don't have any flowers in my house. I don't grow flowers in my garden. But I love to stitch flowers on fabric. So it's just fun to do.
And don't you always have the same, you stitch like the same flower, don't you? The same?
It's pretty much the same flower most of the time. It's a 5-petal, fat bottom, pointy. Yeah, it's pretty much the same flower.
If you've seen any of Heather's videos, I'm sure you've seen her flowers. But I was going to ask, so if you are planning a quilt, like a whole cloth quilt, how do you decide even where to begin planning a quilting design for something like that?
Well, that also depends on how you want to go about designing that whole cloth quilt. A lot of people, when they think about a whole cloth quilt, they think of it being very symmetrical. And they often make it very medallion based, meaning it starts in the center and it grows equally as it goes out. So maybe there's something round in the center or oblong in the center, and then there's something on each of the 4 corners, and then there's something in borders. So that's a very traditional whole cloth quilt. And oftentimes, you know, stitch a bouquet of flowers with a ribbon, and then the oval around it, and then in the corners they'll put some feathers, and then they'll put in a border, and you know, whatever. However, when I do whole cloth quilts, generally what I do is I start with some sort of motif that's off center. Often it's flowers because I like them. And then I will quilt a little something around that. And then I might put some sort of shape around that with like a border around it, but it's probably not going to be a circle or an oval. And then I might do some sort of funky border around it. And then I might put another smaller thing that's similar to it offset to that. I'm not going to mark out a whole quilt. I don't like traditional, you know, looking things as much. I don't dislike them. It's just not my thing. I like things to be abstract. I like things to be asymmetrical. So there's lots of ways of going about it. But if you want symmetry, then generally you're starting with that center motif, building in the corners, and then building borders.
Okay, just one more follow-up question, because I know you've talked about how to quilt your quilt and how you work across or you work from one side up. If you are going to do the symmetry, because you know that's what I'm all about, and you do something in the middle, and then would you go out and quilt the corners and then come back in and quilt? Would that mess up any, the way your batting or backing lays at all?
It kind of depends. So let's say you're going to do a bouquet, like I said, of flowers, and you're going to do a ribbon, and then you're going to do an oval. So you could do the outline of the flowers and the outline of the ribbon, and then move to the oval. And then you could do, you know, just feathers in each of the corners, but nothing behind them. And then you could quilt the edges of the border. And then you could move and quilt the edges of the next border if it's not more than 2 inches. And you could get all of that basic stuff done. And then you could go back in and add all of your detail. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, now our next question here, I know you have a lot of familiarity with this type of pattern, but they have a question about, they said they've made mini quilts and they decided to tackle a mariner's compass, but no matter how it's sewn, the blocks will not lay flat. What have I done?
Yeah, that can be a pain. I'm imagining that you probably didn't paper piece them. Had you paper pieced them, they probably would have laid flat. And my experience, I mean, I've designed and made over 48 mariner's compasses, but all paper piece. So let's just pretend it's just any old block that won't lay flat. And that happens often. Suggestion to you is to ask yourself why. Why isn't it laying flat? Is it not laying flat because of bulky seams? Because if that's the problem, that's one fix. Is it not laying flat because you have excess fabric in there somewhere? Meaning that when you sewed a bunch of pieces together, you used kind of chunky seams and the unit ended up smaller. And then when you tried to sew it to the next unit that was bigger, that didn't have a lot of seams, you tried to make it fit. This is one of the issues with working with somebody else's written pattern. You can't really go in there and fudge and say, well, I'm just going to make that unit fit with this unit, because then when the block is done, it's not going to fit the rest of the blocks or whatever. So you kind of have to try to follow those written quote-unquote rules as much as possible. So if I look at a block and I can see there's a little area in one unit where there's some fullness, and that's what's causing it not to lay flat, then I'm going to take out that seam, and I'm going to actually trim the unit that's too big. Seam again, because I'd rather stretch the whole block to fit into the quilt than stretch a little tiny part of the block to fit into the block, because I want the block laying flat when I go to sew it into the quilt. But chances are it's probably an issue with seams that are making it not lay flat. Well, I mean, maybe it's 50-50 that happens. And so you can go into those seams, and so what I do is I kind of get them wet with a washcloth, and then I push them around into all sorts of different directions. I don't really care which way they're going. I just push them around in all different directions and then start flattening them out with my hands and just making those buggers lay flat. And once I get them to lay somewhat flat, then I start to dry them with my hot iron. And so that's a way to just really, you're manhandling the block. You really are. But better to do it now than have to deal with the issue later when you're trying to quilt it out. So, you know, the better that your quilt is laying before you go to quilt it, the easier the quilting is going to be. So those are a couple of different options. Next time, paper piece those buggers. It's just going to be so much easier. It's not going to make them, you know, perfect, because nothing is perfect. Nothing is perfect. It never is. And sometimes we have to kind of get over that. So if it's got a big old bubble in it, yeah, let's fix it. If it's got a slight little poof in it, chances are it's not going to be an issue.
So then how do you decide how much poof is too much poof to be able to be quilted out versus needing to be fixed before you quilt it?
If there's an actual pleat present, that's going to be impossible to quilt out. If there's an area that has, let's say it's raised above the surface or puckering down in away from the surface, less than 1/8 of an inch or so, that's easy to quilt out. In fact, it's going to take care of itself. If it's around 1/4 of an inch of fullness, then that can be taken care of by putting tons of straight pins in that area when I go to quilt it. If it's more than that, if I poke that area in and I can see it underneath the block 1/4 of an inch, then I need to take that puppy apart, trim something down, or stretch something out to make it fit, and really use some steam, lots of steam when I go to press that. Yeah. Or maybe a whole darn block. Sometimes that has to be done.
It's true. Last resort, but you know.
Yeah. We hope not.
Right. All right, next question here. I have almost finished a flannel lap size quilt. I would like to hand tie it instead of quilting it. Do you have any recommendations for the kind of thread, yarn, or embroidery thread that I should use?
Yeah, I think one of the best things to tie your quilts with is pearl cotton. And I generally use a size 8, a 12. I think a 5 is too big, but I think an 8 is really nice. The reason I like the pearl cotton is because it's a twisted fiber and not a loose fiber like embroidery has 6 strands that are loose next to each other. And some people like that little fringe that embroidery floss makes. However, I think it's a weaker fiber. I think that the pearl cotton is a stronger fiber. Also, you know, if you're going to tie that quilt, then our problem is that it's not going to last very long. So tied quilts, they don't last very long, especially if they're made out of cotton, which is what we really like to make our quilts out of. I say this because my grandmother tied all of her quilts, but most of hers were made out of double knit and all kinds of stuff that will be around long after humans are here. That stuff never dies. But with a cotton quilt like flannel, and especially flannel because flannel is actually a weak fabric, I would make sure that I found a way to put a tie every 2 inches. And I know that's freaking you out because you were thinking about tying just in the seam corners or something on 6-inch blocks or 12-inch blocks or something like that. But you can put a tie and end it with a knot rather than with a knot with things hanging out. So it doesn't have to be all that noticeable. The more you tie that quilt, the longer that quilt is going to last. The less you tie that quilt, the less long that quilt is going to last.
Gotcha. All right, our next question here. I need to know the best method for hanging my art quilt. I really don't like to use a quilt sleeve. Any other ideas to sew on the back or other ways to hang it? And I know you have plenty of ideas.
I have lots of ideas. And you are right. One of the downsides of hanging quilts is the quilts are flat. And when you hang something flat on the wall, it doesn't really look all that great. Even if you lift it off the wall a 1/2 inch or an inch, it looks so much better. Now, if you don't want a fancy hanging apparatus, you don't want an apparatus that shows, then your absolute best thing to do is to sew triangles in the corner of your quilt. And so I happen to have, of all things, toilet tissue in front of me because I've had a runny nose all day. But it's perfect because it's a square. And it's very easy for me to show you. So if you take this square and you fold it in half, and like so, and you put one of these in each corner of your quilt. And this raw edge and this raw edge goes along the raw edges of the corner, and this folded is diagonally across the corner of your quilt. And you're going to insert these before you put your binding on. The bigger your quilt, the bigger these need to be. So if you've got a little tiny quilt that's 12 by 18, you could probably do squares that are 6 inches. Fold them in half like this and put one in each corner. What you do after you've done this is then you put a bar across the bottom of wood and a bar across the top, and it tucks into these. And then you just hang from the top bar. But this bottom one also keeps the bottom away from the wall. And if you use wood that is 1/2 inch wide, it will bring your quilt off the wall about 3/4 of an inch. I know that sounds weird, but because of all the fabric and stuff behind it, it brings it off the wall about 3/4 of an inch. And it is amazing the difference that makes. It also makes your quilt hang very true because that bottom bar kind of stretches out the bottom and weights it so that the sides are nice and true. This is my absolute favorite way of doing a quilt so that the hanging apparatus does not show. It's great. It's easy. It's way easier than doing a sleeve, but you have to remember to put those little corners in there when you're putting your binding on. So you want to do those, pin them in place, and do those when you sew your binding to the front and, you know, flip it over to the back and they're already tucked there in place. That being said, if you don't want to do that, I mount probably half of my art quilts have been mounted onto a canvas, a pre-stretched canvas, or onto stretcher bars that I put on a very heavy-duty piece of what's called museum mat board. It's black board that is archival. It means it has no acid in it. Museum mat board. It's pricey, but it's worth every penny. So stretcher bars are those bars that you buy at fine art supply stores, and they have a male and a female end, and the corners miter into each other. And so if you've got a quilt that's 30 by 60, or no, 30 by 40, you get 2 of the bars that are 30 inches and 2 that are 40 inches, and you put them together. And then I paint them black, and then I top them with that museum mat board. And then and I usually use a staple gun to staple it to that frame, and that frame I painted black, the mat board's black. And then I do what some people consider to be the most dastardly thing on earth. I glue that quilt to that mat board. It is never coming off. So I glue it straight to that mat board. Now, I use a pH neutral glue. I use something that's totally safe. That's not going to hurt the quilt. Any fabric-based glue, any glue that's based for fabric is going to work. Now, alternatively, you can, before you put that mat board onto those stretcher bars, you can sew the quilt to the mat board right inside the binding. And so that means standing up in front of your machine and pushing that thing through so that you don't mess up that mat board. And then you glue the mat board to the stretcher bars. You do the same thing if you want to use a pre-stretched canvas. You would glue it to that pre-stretched canvas. So these are great ways. And what this does is it elevates the art quilt to a piece of art. It looks more like a painting. It looks more like what art buyers and art appreciators are used to seeing, instead of this flat piece on the wall that looks like somebody had hung their bed quilt on the wall, or they cut it into pieces and made it into art. They don't understand that. They want it to look like what their brain registers as art. And I agree with them. There's reasons why the art world has done things the way they've done it for so long. It's because it looks good. And so when we can make our art quilts look more like the quote unquote standard of how art is hung and shown, the better off we are, and the more we, in my opinion, and of course this is my opinion, the more we rise to the same level as fine artists. When we just finish a quilt and put a sleeve on the back and hang it on the wall, it looks just like that. So.
Well, so then, speaking of all the art hanging behind you that everyone can see, how were those done?
So the art hanging behind me, I'm in my studio right now, and I have surrounded myself on all four walls of my studio with some of my pieces that I made, oh, I don't know, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, where I tried to make a piece of art every day. So these are all 8 by 10 little mini quilts. And you've seen tons of them if you watch the videos here, because I use them for samples all the time. And some of the ones that are hanging here are remainders that never sold, whereas others were ones that I never put up for sale because they were my favorites. But anyway, so they are all on dye painted batting. And so it's a little quilt on dye painted batting. It had a backing fabric, but that backing fabric doesn't show. And then I glued them to canvas wrapped board. So it's only about 1/4 of an inch thick, but even so, because I painted them all black, and they're all the same amount bigger than all of the quilts. They look like a little black frame, and it pulls them up off the wall, and it basically finishes them. They all have then a wire apparatus on the back that they hang from, and it just, you know, gives them a lovely little finish. I didn't get one made every day, but I did like 280 some odd of them. And I sold 100 the first month that I displayed them in my gallery. And a lot of those people just hung them the way they were, whereas others, because they were a size that's very easy to frame, they're 10 by 12s, they would stick them in a frame, no glass, but just stuck a frame around them, and the black then acted like a mat around them, and then the frame was on the outside edge of that. So that's another thing that you can do. But yeah, you gotta get that quilt off the flat wall. That's your biggest goal, is get that quilt off the flat wall.
Perfect. And I know, since she was asking, you know, for art quilts, you've done a class for us, and it's one of my favorites, where it was your art quilt assemblage, and you used, I mean, some of the most, I'm going to say, oddball things I've ever seen to hang quilts. I mean, you had old hinges, you had airplane propellers, you had the coolest things. So if you want something like totally different from anything that she just mentioned, that's definitely a class to check out.
Well, here's the thing that I believe. I believe that we all might be quilters, and some of us might be traditionalists, and some of us might be, you know, really out there. But what it comes down to is that what comes first is this love of fabric. But that doesn't limit us. We can add anything to it. I mean, we add stitch to it as it is to, you know, augment our love of fabric. But if we're going to put it on the wall, the whole game changes. What goes for the bed quilt is very different than what goes for the wall quilt. And when it comes to wall quilts, you can throw metal, wood, rocks, glass, words, slash it, burn it, melt it. You can do anything you want to a wall quilt, because You know, you don't have to worry about its launderability. You can always vacuum that puppy.
I'm going to say add to your list, rust it, because that was one of the coolest things I've seen you do with fabric.
Yeah, I love to rust stuff, and I love to use rusted stuff. So
perfect.
Yeah.
All right, our next question here. This is from Mary Jo, and she says, I want you to know how much I appreciate your knowledge and talent, and thank you so much for sharing with us. She wants to know, when is it appropriate to sew the binding on the front and when to sew it on the back?
Well, that's a good question. It depends on how you want to finish the opposite side. If you are going to hand stitch the opposite side, you sew it on the front of the quilt, turn it to the back and hand stitch. If you're going to machine stitch the opposite side, then you're going to sew it on the back of the quilt, flip it to the front and machine stitch. And the reason we do this is because if you're going to machine stitch it, you want it to look really good on the front, and if it doesn't look as good on the back, that's okay. And it's the same thing with the hand stitching. You know, if your hand stitching is going to show, you want it to show on the back, not show on the front. So what we're going to put it on first, the place that the machine stitching is going to be nice and tidy, and we're going to put it on second, the place where we can get away with things not being so perfect because of the way we're going to finish it. So again, I'm going to reiterate, if we're going to hand stitch, the binding goes on the front, gets flipped to the back and hand stitch. If we're going to machine stitch that second side, we're going to put it on the back and flip it to the front and machine stitch.
Absolutely. And we did just, I believe, post a video shortly, either it's coming out shortly or it just went live, where you demonstrate the hand applique stitch you use for your bindings. So if you want to see a visual on that, if it's not up right now, it should be within the next week or so. All right, our next one here. I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this without visuals, but I'm going to let you have a go at it. But they want to know how you put together a hexagon quilt.
Oh, a hexagon, little hexies. Yeah. Well, hexies are very popular right now. I think they're still popular, but they've definitely had a really long run. So most people, they use little pieces of paper that they put inside the hexie, and then they turn all of those sides either with starch or by just pressing them over and then hand stitching along them, knowing that those hand stitches are coming out. So there are two options that I know of. One is by hand, which is the most common way that these are sewn together, and the other is using a blind hem stitch on your machine. I have tried doing it with a blind hem stitch, and I would rather do it by hand any day of the week, as long as I know that I have a good hand stitch. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your two hexies that still have the paper in them. Okay, so leave the paper in them until after they're sewn together. And you're going to put them right sides together. And the stitch that you're going to be using is called a whip stitch. So you want a relatively short piece of thread, about 18 inches, so that when you pull the tail through, you've got about 12 inches. You want to put a tiny knot on the end. And you're going to put those two hexies together, and you're going to start at one end of that seam. And you're going to push the needle through, and what you're going to be doing is you're grabbing just the top thread that's on that folded edge, and then pushing through just the top thread that's on the other folded edge. Now you're thinking, oh, just one thread? Well, it's one thread that's 1/4 inch in from the seam, from the raw edge. So it's a very secure thread you're grabbing. And this is the same thing we do with applique, is just grabbing that one little thread. So you're going to grab that thread and pull the needle all the way through. Then you're going to bring the needle back to the first side where it went through again, and about 1/8 of an inch away, and you're going to do the same thing. Take one little stitch of thread through the front, one little stitch of thread through the back, and pull it through. And you're just going to keep doing that about 1/8 of an inch away, and that is called, that's a slip stitch. And it's just a really easy stitch. And so what you do is you sew these together in long rows. And then you very carefully sew those rows together. And those rows are a little harder because you're doing a Y seam with every single one. But once you've done one row together, you realize how easy it is to sew together. So these hexies are for people who have a lot of time to do handwork. It's not quick, but it can be very, very fun. Now, after you've sewn 3 rows together, you can remove the paper from the middle row. but I don't suggest removing the paper until the whole hexie is ensconced in other hexies around. I think it's important to leave that paper in. I think it makes grabbing that one little thread easier because that paper gives you kind of a barrier. When the paper is not there, then that edge is softer, and you often take more than one thread, and then you end up with a kind of a just not as neat and tidy of a seam. But that's kind of how they go together.
So then is this English paper piecing? Is that what this is?
English paper piecing, yep.
Is there any other pattern other than, I've only ever seen the Hexagon English paper piecing. Like there's other patterns though for English paper?
I've done circles that way. I've done circles with English paper piecing. Just circles, not yo-yos, but circles, yeah.
Okay. Now, my background is more in sewing than in quilting. And in sewing, it's very common to use beeswax or something to treat your thread with before you use it. Would you ever do that with quilting?
Absolutely. If you're using a thread, if you're using a high quality thread, you shouldn't have to use beeswax. And beeswax isn't necessarily the best product. There's another product called Thread Heaven. It comes in a little blue square, and it's actually a silicone type product. It feels kind of like silly putty, but it's clear. And what it does is it actually changes the polarization of threads so that it won't knot up. I'm not sure exactly how it does it, but that's kind of what it does. And it's kind of nice because, first of all, beeswax can get kind of chunky and it can sit on the surface, and it can get, if you iron it, it can get stuck in the fibers of your fabric, and that can be kind of a pain. So I always use Thread Heaven. It's nice. It's a great thread lubricant.
Perfect. Absolutely. It almost looks like we should put on the end of a pool cue, little tiny cubes, you know.
Yeah, that's what it looks. That's what the little square looks like. Yeah.
All right.
Next, it lasts forever.
The one little thing. Yeah. Absolutely. All right. This next question, we've gotten it several times in the past, and we just recently got it again. But they want to know, if you only piece a top but send it quilted, are you still considered a quilter?
I'm sorry, you kind of broke up there. Could you repeat that? Yeah.
So if you only piece the top but send it to someone else to be quilted, are you still considered a quilter?
You know, these questions are always really hard to answer because I don't want to tick off a bunch of people. I think that the term quilter is a term that we've given to people who make quilts. That means that their end product is a quilt. So if you end up with a bunch of quilts after you creatively spend your time and energy, I guess you can definitely call yourself a quilter. That being said, if we're really honest with ourselves at the project and the process and the end result, then let's kind of talk about that. And the reason I want to bring this up is because, you know, all of us quilt for different reasons. Some of us quilt because we just want quilts in our lives. Some of us quilt because our best friend started quilting and the only time we got to spend with her is when we were quilting. Some of us quilt because we're bored with our life and there's nothing else for us to do. And there's nothing wrong with any of these reasons why we quilt. Some of us quilt because if we don't feel alive. However, all of that being said, I believe that the truest quilters out there are the quilters who design the quilt, make the top, and quilt the quilt. I believe that's theirs. It's their intellectual property. It's their time and energy. It's their fear conquered. It's their everything. So if you buy a pattern from Susie Q and you make the quilt exactly like the pattern, and you even went to the store and found the same fabrics or as many of the same fabrics as Susie Q did in her quilt, and then you have Barbara Jane quilt it for you, in my opinion, you're a piecer. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being a piecer. It's what you enjoy. Frankly, I detest piecing anymore. In fact, if I'm going to work with fabric, I just want to quilt on it. So I do lots of whole cloth quilts. Or I do lots of raw edge applique. I throw things right on top of each other and then stitch them. The precision of piecing has lost all of its pleasure for me. Whereas other people, that precision is all they live for. They love that. They love it when their pieces just come together perfectly and they're just so happy. But when they go sit down to quilt, they're miserable. Well, I don't think you should ever be miserable making a quilt. I think that it should bring you happiness and joy and make you just feel like the best you there is. Does that mean that if you don't quilt your quilts, you can't call yourself a quilter? You can call yourself whatever you want to. You can call yourself Princess Elizabeth if you want to. You can call yourself Master of the Universe if you want to. But if you want to be honest with yourself, then you can, really kind of think about what it is you do. I'm a quilter. I quilt stuff. I have a very good friend who's a piecer. She pieces stuff. I have another friend who's a player. She plays with stuff and she never finishes anything, but she has so much fun. And we're all equally valid in whatever it is we do.
Absolutely. This is why I love talking to you, though, is because if there's anybody that I am exactly opposite of, it is you, because I love intricate piecing and I don't even know where to begin when it comes to quilting, which is why I stick to stitch in the ditch quilting so I can follow the lines of my piecing, and that's what makes me happy. So you and I are exact opposites, and I think it's awesome.
I think it has to do with age. When I was your age, I was the same way. When I was your age, I was so into conquering those things. And then as I got older and I dealt with teenagers and divorce and making a living and all those other things, I began to take life less seriously and I wanted more play in my life. And for me, the machine quilting gives me that play, gives me the permission to do whatever I darn well please. And piecing doesn't really give me that permission. So I think it's a stage in life. And for those of us who started quilting younger, I think we loosen up and we want to move into new things as we get older. And you're just a pup. You're still a pup.
All right. Well, we'll see where I am in a few years.
When you're an old hag, let's talk.
All right. Okay. Well, we have time for one more question here. This came in. This is from Barbara, and she wants to know, what is rested fabric?
I think she's talking about you with rusting fabric.
Oh, I'm glad you picked up on that because I didn't know what she meant. Okay, thank you.
I saw that question come up, and I think that's what she meant. So, Barbara, I like to rust stuff. I like to use rusted stuff, and I like to rust fabric. And rusting fabric can be very, very cool. It simply means that you find an old piece of rusty metal, and you get your fabric wet with some water and some vinegar. And it doesn't really matter how much water and vinegar. It's just some water and vinegar. The more vinegar you use, maybe the more rust you'll get. Who knows? I don't know, because it just depends on the rust. So your fabric should be clean and free from all surface stuff. So prepared for dyeing fabric, or pre-wash your white fabric. Take your rusty bits and either sprinkle them on the fabric or wrap your fabric in them and tie it up, or lay it on top of a big rusty, spiky wheel or something, and then keep it damp. So you can cover it with some plastic, wrap it in some plastic, whatever, open it up every once in a while and spray it with some more vinegary water. Take the plastic off and spray it with some more vinegary water and watch it. You can watch it for a couple hours. You can watch it for a couple of days. I had a friend that actually found an old stove, had rust everywhere, and she just covered that thing with white fabric that had been soaked in vinegar water and got some of the most amazing rusted fabrics. So what it will do is it'll turn the areas that are right in contact with the rust into a beautiful rusty browny orangey color, and the rest of the fabric will turn into this pale buttery gold color. The most important thing I can tell you about it is that when you're done rusting your fabric, that after you have rinsed your fabric out, that you need to soak that fabric in water that has baking soda in it, because the baking soda is going to do two things. It's going to stop the vinegar acting, and the vinegar is attracting that rust. So it's going to stop the acid of the vinegar. It's a neutralizer. So it's going to ask the vinegar to stop working. And it's also going to neutralize the rust itself so that the fabric becomes less fragile. If you don't soak it in that water filled with baking soda, and I don't know what the mix is, let's say something like a half cup of baking soda to a gallon of water. That sounds about right. But the more baking soda, the better. So you want to throw a whole package of baking soda into your 1.5 gallons or 2 gallons of water. Do that, whatever. Let's just get rid of that acid crust. Then wash your fabric like you normally would. And you're going to lose a slight bit of the color, but not much. Now, is this fabric archival? No. Is this fabric great for wall pieces, for art quilts? Absolutely. But when you're designing that piece and when you're making that piece, think about the fact that that fabric is likely to degrade, and make sure you keep that as part of your design ideas. It's really cool. It's the only way I know of getting this sort of design. So it's just another way of creating your own stuff. It's just another way of playing, and that's what we do this to play.
Absolutely. And of course we have a video that shows how you rusted fabric and shows some of the things that you chose to use to create the designs on your fabric, which are pretty cool. So of course we have plenty of resources that show how they're doing wonderful things with fabric. All right, I want to thank you so much for being here and answering all of our quilting questions. And
absolutely, it was great fun.
Absolutely. All right, and we hope everyone has a good night.
All right.